All right, and with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for another Mass Medic webinar. Today, we're talking about writing to mitigate product liability risk. And I'm pleased to present this webinar from Medmark Insurance Group. And if you haven't met me, I'm Anna King, a marketing coordinator at Mass Medic. And if you're not familiar with our organization, we're a membership-based trade association for the medical device industry. And we work to promote our ecosystem in New England through connection, education, events like this, advocacy, and awareness. I do have a quick housekeeping note before I turn it over. So this webinar is being recorded, and all of the registrants will receive the recording after the presentation. We're also leaving some time for a Q&A at the end, so make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So now I'm pleased to introduce Kate Kloss. She is the Senior Risk Management Attorney, FDA Specialist with Medmark. Her focus is on legal matters faced by participants in the life sciences industry, specifically FDA regulatory compliance. So thanks so much for being here, Kate, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm excited to work with this group of from Massachusetts, as that's where I am based, even though Medmark is headquartered in the DC area. Couple of brief disclaimers before we get started. Today, we're going to talk a bit about products liability in general and how documents can impact a company's overall risk profile. We'll look at how in the litigation process, a plaintiff gets a hold of documents that a company creates, and we'll talk about some best practices for ways to avoid creating problematic documents. So let's get started with a look at products liability. What is it? Products liability is a legal theory that recognizes that a seller, a manufacturer of a product is better positioned than the average buyer, consumer of a product to suffer any damages resulting from a product defect. So some examples that I'm sure everyone has heard of over the years. The McDonald's hot coffee case was a classic example of a products liability claim. At the time, it was sort of a late night TV punchline, but the plaintiff in this case had a valid claim to make against McDonald's. And the reason for that was that, at this time in the 80s, McDonald's was anticipating that its customers would get coffee to go and take it to a destination before drinking it. And they wanted the coffee to be hot when the customer arrived at their destination and was ready to drink it. So they told their franchisees that they wanted them to hold coffee at a temperature of 190 degrees. And this was a lot different than most restaurants. Coffee is typically served around 140 degrees. And in this case, the plaintiff was an elderly woman. Her grandson was driving her through a McDonald's drive-thru. She got a cup of coffee. They pulled into a parking spot so that she could add cream and sugar or whatever to her drink. And she was holding it in her lap. And as she took off the lid to add the cream, she jostled the cup and it spilled in her lap. And because the coffee was so hot, in the few minutes that took her to, jump out of the car and pull the clothing away from her skin, she suffered very serious burns that left her with lifelong injuries that she had to deal with. And the argument that her attorneys made in this case was that because the coffee was so different from what the reasonable consumer would expect at a typical restaurant when ordering a cup of coffee, that it was the plaintiff was, because she was left unaware of the difference in the way that McDonald's was handling their coffee, she was injured. Had she been given the information, she may have been better able to protect herself from injury. Similarly, in the case of the Ford Pinto, this was an example of a design defect rather than a warning defect in the McDonald's case. In the case of the Pinto, Ford was trying to develop competition against all of the European subcompact cars that were coming into the United States in the late 60s and early 70s. So they told their engineering team they wanted to create a model that was under 2,000 pounds and under $2,000. And they wanted it on the market as soon as possible. They gave their engineers a design period that was much shorter than their typical design period for introducing a new model. And it was so compressed that they were beginning the tooling of all of the machines before the design was really complete. And the engineers discovered that the gas tank in the Pinto had been placed in a position that was really vulnerable to even low speed impact. It could be punctured, causing leaking of fuel and fire. They went to the executive team with a fix. They had a piece that was relatively inexpensive that could be placed over the gas tank to protect it in the event of a low speed impact. But the executive team was really focused on that 2,000 pound, $2,000 limit. So they said, no, just go ahead with the design as is. And they did. And the result was that people were getting into fender benders and ending up stuck in a car that was on fire. Ford spent the better part of a decade in litigation, and it cost them millions of dollars as well as a hit to their reputation. And then, of course, tobacco was another case in which the manufacturers had a lot of information about health risks to consumers of their products. They did not disclose that risk, and that risk led to quite a lot of damage to the customer base. How do we know when a product is defective? A product is defective if it is unreasonably dangerous. And something that is unreasonably dangerous is beyond what is expected by a reasonable consumer, and it's beyond what a reasonable seller would choose to put on the market. The defect needs to exist at the time that the product leaves the manufacturer's control, and the defect needs to be the cause of the injury. And when we say that it needs to be the cause of the injury, it needs to be the direct or the proximate cause. So picture, for example, a mountain bike. It's designed to be rugged for outdoor use, riding down really rough surfaces. A manufacturer of a mountain bike cheaps out. They use material that is not equipped to handle this kind of rugged use. And while someone is riding the bike down a mountain, the frame gives way, they're thrown from the bike and injured. That would be the fact that they created this defect, and the defect itself is what led to the injury. That would be a defective product for products liability purposes. If you took that exact same mountain bike and had someone riding it around the city and they are hit by a taxi, the introduction of the taxi into that scenario breaks up the line between the defect and the injury itself. So in that case, even though the same exact defect existed in the product, it was not the cause of the injury. In products liability, there are three different theories that can give rise to a claim. The first is a manufacturing defect. And in a manufacturing defect, the plaintiff needs to demonstrate that the product is different from its intended design, from its specifications in some way, and that defect was present when it left the manufacturer's control. So this could be something like contamination. It could be a problem in the manufacturing process. It could be some type of deviation from the specifications that renders the product defective. The second theory is a design defect. This is like the Ford Pinto, where there was some type of alternative design that was reasonable and it was safe and feasible, and the manufacturer chose not to use it. This could be failing to conform to state-of-the-art standards, not keeping up with the pace of industry. It can be failing to include safety features like an automatic shutoff. Anything like that, where there is a feasible alternative that is that is left behind in the design process. And finally, a warning defect, like the McDonald's hot coffee case. In a warning defect situation, the plaintiff needs to demonstrate that there was a foreseeable risk and that the risk of harm could have been mitigated if the appropriate warnings had been provided to the customer. And because the manufacturer did not provide those warnings, it made the product unsafe for the user. This could be failing to put appropriate warning language into your user manual. It could be failing to put stickers or printing on the device itself when it is something that's likely to be separated from its user manual. Any kind of information that is known to the manufacturer and not given to the user in an appropriate manner could present some sort of warning defect. I wanted to give some examples of how these different defects can appear in documentation. So in this quote, we have it's a conversation within a company talking about a potential supply chain partner. And the person is saying, with reference to your conversations with Medco and myself, this will confirm that under the circumstances of your purchase agreement with Medco, it is our recommendation that Medco be made responsible for all their liability associated with the inferior products they are making and supplying for us. And by stating that you believe your supply chain partner is presenting you with inferior products, and this is during the contract negotiation process, it's giving a negative appearance for your own company that you are choosing to purchase material from this company, even though you believe that their materials are not adequate. It's shining more of a light that's unintended on the potential defendant rather than shifting that responsibility to their supply chain partner. An example of a design defect in a document. Take, for example, an R&D staffer is writing a memo to their supervisor to recommend a design change to a product. It is a small design change. They make clear in this memo that it could dramatically improve the safety of the product. It's only a 30-cent per unit design modification, but the manufacturer decides not to do it based on a cost benefit analysis, and the memo is filed away and kind of forgotten about. Imagine years later that this memo is turned over during discovery and a plaintiff's attorney finds it and uses it as the centerpiece of their product's liability case. There's a lot of context that is missing here. Could it be that this 30% per unit design modification was intended to go into something that is only costing $1 per unit? That would not be a reasonable, it's a 1/3 increase in the cost of each unit. Unless there was a significant safety problem to be solved, that really may not be reasonable. And I think if that context were incorporated into the memo, and if there were a second memo written about why providing the justification for disregarding the suggestion of the engineer, it would really take this situation from being a potential smoking gun to something that is much less serious for the company itself. And then finally, an example of a warning defect. In this quote, we have them saying that in a test of incoming raw material, they found an unusual particulate in a proprietary blend. And they went back to see if anything like that had been noted in previous shipments, and they saw that it was in the previous shipment as well. They're asking about whether there was a potential change to specs. And then they state, we have half a dozen lots of product already in the field, ! I hope we don't hear about any customers with complications, or this will become a major problem. So there are a couple of factual statements, and then there is a lot of speculation that really creates the problem in the document. So finding particulate, trying to confirm whether it's been seen before, trying to see if there's some problem with an ingredient differing from the intended specs, that is absolutely normal, appropriate work. The problem here is saying that You have half a dozen lots of product already in the field, and that if there are complications, that number one, it would be related to this particulate in some way, or two, that it would become a major problem. If there's further investigation, you should be able to determine if the particulate is problematic. You should be able to look at release testing from the previous lots to see if the final product differed from spec in any way. There's really a lot of speculation and embellishment and a little bit less of a focus on the facts of the underlying situation. And this is what makes a document problematic, when there is emotion incorporated over fact. So why are documents so important in products liability litigation? First, the cost of tort litigation in the United States is kind of ridiculous. It cost the US economy $443 billion in 2020. And some federal budgets, by contrast, these are actually 2020 budgets, sorry. The entire Department of Homeland Security in 2020 cost $50.47 billion. The Department of Education, $72.7 billion. FDA only got $3.16 billion. And unfortunately, businesses with annual revenues on the lower end bear a disproportionate share of the burden. So they're earning 19% of revenues versus bearing 53% of tort costs. US companies suffer hundreds of billions of dollars per year in lost product sales because this spending on litigation is impacting the amount of money that they have available to invest in research and development. And we are really out of step with our global competitors. In the US, we're spending 2.3% of GDP on tort costs, but that number is only 0.7% in the UK, 0.8% in Japan, and 1.1% in Germany. Why is that? The reason is that we have an incredibly well-organized plaintiffs bar. They're constantly trolling for new plaintiffs on TV. I think we are all familiar with these types of ads. They are on the internet. You can type just a few general terms and in a fraction of a second have millions of results. There's also a massive amount of publicly available information about potentially defective drugs and devices, mostly on FDA's own website. There's recall information, warning letters, adverse event reports that are publicly available, and the plaintiffs' bar is well aware that these resources exist. We do regular surveys of our defense attorneys. They work across the United States, and they consistently say, 65% of them consistently stated that in some or most of their cases, the plaintiff was attracted to or became aware of a potential cause of action because of some FDA enforcement action, whether it was a recall or warning letter. There is a substantial connection between plaintiffs becoming aware of one of these incidents and then saying, well, I've used that product too, and I've had issues. Maybe I should reach out to an attorney. And when you're looking at the people who will be deciding whether your company has created a product defect that caused an injury to a plaintiff, you have to think about the way jury pools are viewing the life sciences industry as a whole. It is very easy for them to empathize with the plaintiff. They can understand and appreciate the fear that's associated with defects in really foundational products like medical devices or pharmaceuticals. They're going to have sympathy for these injured plaintiffs. They'll look at them as, what if this happened to me? What if this happened to my family member? And the public tends to be fairly wary of corporations in general, and there is a particularly poor public perception of FDA regulated industry. Terms like big pharma are thrown around all the time as this, really industry boogeyman, the people who are just trying to take your money without providing you with helpful products. And when you're thinking about your jury pool and the face that they're putting on the industry, it's this guy. It's not the people who are out there trying to do the right thing and get products that are needed to the people who need them. So you're already operating from a place of you have an uphill battle as a life sciences company. And plaintiffs frequently rely on documents to prove their case, which is why they're so critical. So let's talk for a minute about how plaintiffs actually get a hold of your documents. And it is in the discovery process. Discovery is the first phase of products liability litigation. And in the discovery process, the plaintiff can send a request for a lot of documentation to any potential defendants, requiring them to turn over documents and any other materials potentially related to the case. And they will make this request extremely broad, looking for really anything that is possibly related. And the federal rules of civil procedure have taken a very broad view of what that actually means. So documents includes any paper items, electronically stored, writings, drawings, graphs, charts, photographs, sound recordings, data compilations stored in any medium that can reasonably respond to the questions from the plaintiff. And that has changed over the years because of the way business has changed. It includes all relevant documents. So it's things like letters and memos and emails. It's what's in your calendars and on meeting agendas and financial documents and contracts. But it's also things like Slack and Teams messages and chats. It's what's in your social media, photographs. It's cell phone data, including text messages. And if you're using your personal email or your personal cell phone for work purposes, this can open a path to your personal data. So if you are, if you need to access a document and you email it to your personal account, it is possible that if that is a relevant document, it could gain the plaintiff access to your personal email account because you do business. It would be their argument. You're doing business in your personal email account. Same for text messages as well. And because life sciences companies are subject to so much documentation regulation from FDA, they have everything encompassed by Rule 34, as well as everything that constitutes your product. So any labels or advertising, any maintenance instructions, any catalogs, claims about your product, owner's manual information, warranty information, servicing, installation instructions, all of that is considered part of your product and would therefore be subject to disclosure in the discovery process. Because life sciences companies have this requirement to create copious documentation, they also have a document management problem. Without a document retention policy in place that really makes sense for your operations, companies can tend to hang on to documents longer than they need to. So you have your statutory obligation to retain your documents for a certain period of time, but companies will tend to hang on to them longer just as just in case, the way that people may hang on to tax returns just in case they're ever audited, or receipts in case you're ever audited. The problem with this is that it increases the discovery burden. If you don't have a document retention policy that calls for destruction after a certain period of time, you are going to have more and more documents that are able to be accessed through the discovery process. And it increases the likelihood that there could be something problematic for the plaintiffs to find. So it makes sense to work with your counsel and create a policy that, of course, meets your statutory obligation, but doesn't go too far beyond that. It needs to really limit the amount of material that you're hanging on to that could be subject to discovery in the event of a claim. Also, I wanted to talk a bit about how discovery has changed over the years. Uh, Business records are typically created electronically now, and many of them are never converted to paper form. So discovery has sort of followed this format as well. When I first started out as a young attorney, we were the ones who were typically sent to, a random conference room in some building somewhere in the country to dig through boxes and boxes and boxes of documents. So you were hoping that this young, inexperienced attorney would hopefully not hit on problematic documents because they were just overwhelmed by the volume. Now the process is much different. Uh, we typically have electronic discovery. So there's a virtual data room, and it is possible to use software to search through the documents. You can plug in particular keywords or any other red flags, things like handwritten notes in margins or exclamation points. And this really increases the likelihood that there will be some sort of hit that comes up, rather than just the random luck of finding that one document in a room full of boxes of paper. Most important part is to look at what you do on a day-to-day basis that can help you to avoid creating these problematic documents. And two things are really critical. The first is the tone of your writing, and the second is the content. Tone is the emotional portion of any document that you're creating. It's the way that you're saying something, the manner of the expression. It's writing in all capitals being interpreted as yelling. Whereas, an example of how this can be truly problematic is this is from the mesothelioma litigation years back. And this quote was so egregious that it actually made it into the Wall Street Journal at the time. And the company who was the defendant in this case, they somehow had just someone from their finance department who was involved in writing the checks for the plaintiffs, was quoted as saying that she didn't want to spend the rest of her career paying off people who are a little afraid of some silly lung problem. And these were people who were dying of a terrible disease that was caused by exposure to a product that this company made. And it read as so callous that it really it presented this company in a really bad light. This is the kind of thing that is much more appropriate if you need to express it to be, it's venting to a coworker or venting to a family member. This is not ever something that should be recorded in any way. Tone is just as important as the substance in a narrative statement, and sometimes more important. It is always there, whether you intend for it to be there or not. And the best tone to use is a supportive tone. It should be the primary tone in business writing. And it's affected by the physical appearance of the written word as well. Exclamation points, capital letters, bolding, underlining, all of these are going to play into the way that a document is read. It's going to influence the tone of the document. So it's important to think about what you're actually doing and how you're capturing that information. Content is what you're actually trying to say. It's the substance of any document. So I wanted to use this as an example, and I want you to think about how this would sound to a jury. A lot was sampled in a routine release test. Results reveal that 22% of the product units do not match the specs, meaning that 22% of the total number of units produced are probably defective. Since this problem has just been identified, there's no way of knowing how many defective units have already been shipped. There's a lot to unpack here. First of all, what are the facts that we know from this statement? We know that they sampled a lot in routine release testing, and we know that 22% did not meet specs. The rest of it is all speculation. So if they know that 22% of the product units do not match the specs, this person went on to say that that means the 22% of the total number of units produced are probably defective. This is wild speculation. They haven't established that this failure to meet specs is actually resulting in a product defect. Is the product still performing as it was intended to perform? Is it the kind of problem that could go on to cause injury or damage to a user? None of that is known at this point. There's been no investigation conducted. They say since the problem has just been identified, there's no way of knowing how many defective units have already been shipped. Well, this is a problem too, because of course they should know how many defective units have been shipped if they are even defective. All of this should be part of your testing before a product is actually hitting the market. If something in release testing is not meeting specs, it should be quarantined until the product has been either determined to be acceptable and can be released, or determined to be defective in some way and either scrapped or reworked. Not knowing how many units of product have issues is a major problem. So speculating about it in this way, in this emotional way, kind of gives an appearance that the company doesn't really know what they're doing, which I don't think is the intent. They're trying to convey that, they have some products with issues, but they're perhaps using shorthand, they're using speculation, and all of that is presenting a picture that just isn't factual. So think about this too. How would your opinion of this document change if the writer had included additional context, like the defect being, a printing error in the manufacturer's information on the package, or that the logo color was wrong? These are things where, perhaps they are different from spec, but they are not going to have any impact on the product itself. This context is critical, and having some document that is retained that contains all of that emotion and all of that speculation without this type of critical context really just enhances the problem that document is creating. So it's important when you're thinking about the content of a document, you want to ensure that all relevant information is there. You want the facts, you want it to be put into context. You want to avoid any unsupported statements or conclusions, like assuming that 22% of all units produced are going to be defective just because you had 22% failing to meet spec in some way in one test. You want to use clear and objective language rather than emotional language. And you want to avoid elaboration and embellishment and a lot of the opinion, the subjective information. It's also really important to stick to your area of expertise, things that are your responsibility. If you have someone spouting off in a document about another department's work and how that's not being performed appropriately, you're putting problematic information that maybe is not appropriate for you to be recording. It may not be accurate at all if that's not your role in the company, your area of expertise. You want to avoid editorializing or opining in these types of business documents. And it's also important to think about, the tone when you're and the content as well when you're talking about using humor in documents. We all need to have a sense of humor when we're doing our work on a day-to-day basis. But keeping that humor out of documentation can be important. So documents that be can be found over time that have problematic uh, content in them or problematic tones. It can be things like internal memos, external communications, emails, any manufacturing process, production documents, you know, things that are going to be retained over time due to FDA regulations, and as well as complaint and customer service documents. The customer service team is really critical in preventing capturing problematic information. Because what they're doing a lot of the time is interacting with people who have some sort of a problem. And in our experience, we have seen that it can become a habit for customer service reps to want to capture all of the information. So they start to get into a habit or routine of transcribing what a caller is saying rather than listening for facts and capturing the facts. And when you are transcribing everything that this person is saying, this caller is saying, when they're upset about some facet or some interaction with your company, if you're transcribing all of that emotion and that is what is saved and sent up the chain throughout any kind of investigation or follow-up that might occur, it's including that kind of emotional elaboration. It's subjective rather than objective information. And when that is, saved for a number of years and accessed at a later time, you may not have the employees still with your company who are able to provide the context for it. So it's really critical to ensure that the documents are speaking for themselves, that they're giving a full picture and they're not leaving out really critical information that allows you to understand what the document was actually saying. So think when you're writing documents, are you using some kind of shorthand? Are you putting into writing something that is really better delivered in a phone call? Often when we have a particular issue that needs to be addressed, the best approach is to have an in-person meeting, have a phone call about it, and then even that time, just in any delays that are caused by arranging a time to speak, sort of provides a cooling off period that lets you think about, what are the actual facts that we need to work through here? And what is the best plan to do that? And once you've had that either in-person meeting or phone conversation, if you're able to, write up a document to memorialize what was discussed, what the plan is going forward, you're more likely to develop not only a useful document, but one that will have a lot of clarity down the road, should anyone need to access that document in the future. It's important to remember that every copy of an internal document is discoverable. So if you have drafted a memo or you've sent around a meeting agenda, every copy that you send out is going to be discoverable. So maybe you delete the original file, but someone might save it or print it and then stick that in some file that they have that can later be accessed. If you want to maintain control over a document, once it has been shared, the horse is out of the barn. So you need to think about that before you circulate documentation as well. And then, we all do this in meetings. We might doodle in the margin of a piece of paper of an agenda or something like that. But think about the fact that those could turn up on documents as well. So is a skull and crossbones an appropriate doodle for the margin of a document that's talking about a switch that could potentially lead to a fire? Probably not. And it's something that is, just sort of a mindless thing that you're doing during the course of your day. Um, but it's deserving of a bit more thought than that. So this is an example of how word choice can make a big difference in the way a document is perceived. So this says an outline is attached for an experimental design to provide minimally required information to support a product development. This scheme is structured to include the shortest practical time course for completion and at as low a cost as possible. This is probably an appropriate business objective, but the word choices here are giving a really negative picture of the company's operations. So if they're talking about an experimental design and saying they want to provide minimally required information, it sounds like they're trying to cut corners. By describing it as a scheme, that it provides a negative connotation of what they're doing. If they're trying to include it in the shortest practical time course for completion and at as low a cost as possible, all of that reinforces the picture that this is a company that is trying to cut corners. They're focused on a short amount of time, the minimal amount of work. They're focused on keeping the cost low. And it's really critical for a company to avoid giving that picture of their operations and of their company culture. So how could the word choice have impacted the way that this picture is presented? We'll look at some additional choices in just a moment. This is another example in a memo. It's someone using, shorthand and humor, talking about a conversation that was had between colleagues. And here they're talking about some sort of particulate seen in material and trying to figure out, what is the issue? Why when we're producing this, is this happening? Clearly it's not supposed to have particulates. So, what's the underlying cause here? And the employees, when they were looking at it and conducting this investigation, they were joking around and saying that the particulates looked like mouse turds. And that is, it might have been funny between the coworkers, but when it appears in a memo, it's memorialized in a memo. That is a really unflattering picture for a company operating in a space where contamination and adulteration can carry criminal penalties. It's a poor choice of words that is, it's an error of your own making. It doesn't need to be recorded in this way. So think about how you can impact the overall tone of your document through word choice. All of these words can be appropriate in the right context, but you actually have to think about, is it the right word in this context? So let's look at some word choices and how they can impact the message that's conveyed. So here, if they were to say the analysis may indicate device failure, that could be a valid statement. Maybe it is the appropriate choice of word. But with something like the analysis may indicate that the device will require adjustment, is that also true? And if so, is this a better way to phrase it? Is it a more accurate picture than to say that the device will fail? Here, the memo misrepresented the test results. Might be appropriate. What about the memo did not provide all of the relevant information about the test results? Using the word misrepresented implies that they're lying, which is a much different connotation, a much different tone feeling than saying that relevant information was lacking from the final report of the test results. This is another example of something that should never be put in writing. This is venting. The thing that is really galling is that I feel like I have been beaten by my own company instead of the competition. To put a questionable lot of product on the market is inexcusable. I don't know who's responsible for this decision, but it has to rank right up there with the Pinto gas tank. This is, it's someone having a frustrating day. It should never, ever end up in writing. But sometimes it does. And people they do it without thinking, which is why, if you're having this kind of reaction to something, pick up a phone before you start typing out an email. This is an example of inappropriate humor. If you're having a meeting about a potential product problem and you're stating, Houston, we have a problem in the subject line. Maybe your team finds it funny, but down the road, when there's no context associated with it, it can appear as though the company wasn't taking what could be a very serious problem seriously. And then this is an example of, a report after there's some kind of batch testing showing unexpected results. And the information is stating that the raw material control was woefully unsatisfactory and failed to meet requirements, FDA's requirements. And, if I was the FDA, I would shut it down. This is, it's not appropriate information for this type of report. It's opinion, it is not fact. And, it is the wrong time and place. And then finally, this is an example of a case in which a document recorded potential issues in some units of a device where they speculated that the condition will probably lead to the unit shorting out and possibly catching on fire or becoming electrically live. And the field corrective action for product that was out on the market is recorded as there isn't much that we can do about these units. We'll just have to replace them when defective ones are reported. If the case is that these devices are possibly going to lead to fires or becoming electrically live, saying that there isn't much we can do about devices that are already out there is not an appropriate response to the problem. If things are going to catch fire or become electrically live, there's a significant chance of injury. This would call for a product recall. So I think the speculation about what the miswiring is going to lead to is probably not in line with the actual outcome. If that were the case, then hopefully this company would be recalling product that is out on the market rather than kind of throwing up their hands and saying, I guess we'll send them replacements when people are electrocuted. So finally, the best rule of thumb is to think about documents and the fact that document authors oftentimes end up on the witness stand in a trial. So if you don't want to hear what you've written read aloud in a courtroom, just don't put it in writing. Make the phone call first, document the facts later. And with that, I will turn it back over to Anna.
Awesome. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate. We do have time to answer a question here. So let me pull this up. The question is, so what if there was a risk to the user of a product, but the risk or the potential for a risk was unknown to the manufacturer and was never detected during design and testing? Then the risk actually occurs in usage and somebody is harmed.
So at that point, you're now aware that the risk exists. So you have a duty to warn going forward. You would need to change your labeling at that point to disclose the risk, tell them how to prevent it, or if there's a particular population that the product won't work for because of this risk. Once the company becomes aware of it, it is their duty to respond.
Wonderful. Thank you. And with that, I think that we've reached our time. So I want to take a second to thank you all for joining us today. And thanks to Medmark and Kate for such a wonderful presentation. We cannot put on great educational content like this without your support. So thank you. And to learn more about upcoming MassMedic events, check us out on social media or visit massmedic.com. But with that, thank you everyone and have a wonderful day.